Yeah.
Hello, everyone. While we're waiting for more audience members to stream in, I'll make a couple of announcements and introduce the speakers today. Thanks, everybody, for coming. This is the 13th CPHS Research Seminar. In October, we will be a year old. We've managed to do seminars almost every single month. We are amazed at the research output that's coming out of CPHS. Today, we have researchers from the Tata-Cornell Institute for Agriculture and Nutrition, from Cornell University, as well as from IIM Ahmedabad, presenting their findings. Their presentation is titled COVID-19 and Nutrition Security, Findings from Tata-Cornell Institute Research on Gender and Nutrition in India. I'd like to welcome Prabhu Pingali, who's the director of the Tata-Cornell Institute, along with his colleagues, Soumya Gupta and Andali Brahman. Also with us is Vidya Vemireddy, who did her PhD at the Dyson School at Cornell University and was affiliated with TCI during her time there. Vidya is now an assistant professor at IIM Ahmedabad. Discussing the paper today, we have Professor Mahendra Dev, who is the director of the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. And I have the great honor to say that I was also briefly his colleague. Thank you all for coming and for agreeing to participate in today's proceedings. Before I hand it over to you, just a couple of quick announcements to the audience so that you know. Next month is a very exciting month for us. September marks the beginning of a new wave that will start wave 24 of CPHS. Every time there's a new wave, we take stock of what happened in the previous wave. So we will be conducting a webinar on the 23rd of September to tell you about some of our findings from wave 23. It will be called Stories from Wave 23. If you'd like to know what it's like, we did stories from wave 22 4 months ago. You can find that video on our website. We'll also be having another CPHS research seminar. Kunal Mangal, who is now a postdoc at Azim Premji University and completed his PhD at the Harvard Kennedy School, has a really exciting paper on the demand for public sector jobs in India. That will be on the 9th of September. We'll be posting all of this on our website as well as our Twitter handle, which is @_CPHS. So please follow us and you can find more details on our website. It's now 6:35 p.m. So Prabhu, welcome. Thank you so much for participating in the 13th CPHS Research Seminar, despite all the other events and research seminars that are taking place at this time. And despite being jet lagged, we are really, really delighted to have you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Mahesh. Good evening, good morning. Greetings to all of you from Cornell University. It's a great pleasure for myself and our team here to be part of the CPHS Research Seminar Series. Let me say that CMIE is doing an enormously important job in filling a major data gap that we have in India on understanding what households are doing, what rural households are doing in terms of consumption, overall incomes, production practices, etc. And we've been fortunate to have this database and be able to use this for the work we're doing. Let me very briefly introduce you to the Tata-Cornell Institute, and then the rest of the team can take on the more technical side of the presentation. The Tata-Cornell Institute for Agriculture and Nutrition is a long-term research institute that was established at Cornell University in 2013. So we'll be getting close to our 10th anniversary soon. And this institute was set up with a very generous gift that was given by Mr. Ratan Tata. And the focus of our work is on understanding why, despite the growth and despite India being considered an emerging economy, etc., India continues to have the largest numbers and a very large share of the global population of malnourished people, especially women and children, and also the large share of the global population of poor, especially the rural poor. And our mission is to understand why India continues to have the stubbornly high levels of malnutrition and rural poverty, and what are potential solutions to this, especially through looking at drivers of change. And one of the big drivers of change being agriculture and the transformation of food systems as driving rural transformation, improving diets, improving nutrition, and improving rural livelihoods. So that's been the mission we've been working on for the past several years. Our program is very much designed around PhD students and postdoctoral fellows. And so we've been bringing in around 4 PhD students every year into the program, and we've been graduating around 4 a year over the past few years. Been very fortunate to have had around 13 PhDs graduate over the last 6 years or so. And our pipeline now has around 16 PhD students, plus another 6 postdoctoral fellows that have gone through this program. In addition to that, we've got long-term scientific capacity based in India. We have an office in Delhi, and then we have a small office in Dubai where Soumya Gupta has been working out of. And so it's been a good team, and we've been pulling together as much evidence as we can and creating an analytical base that can help us understand this conundrum that India has been in, and then look at ways in which one can give evidence-based policy advice to governments on the way forward in helping improve nutrition and rural livelihoods. So as we think about creating an evidence base, obviously the issue of data becomes really important. And a lot of our focus has been doing field-based research, doing action-oriented research, using RCTs, etc., in trying to tease out some of those causal relationships. But having nationally representative longitudinal data is absolutely crucial. And that's been an area that historically India has had a lot of important investments done in nationally representative databases. The National Sample Survey is well known for the quality of the work, for the quality of the data, etc. Unfortunately, that investment hasn't been kept up, and there's been a significant data gap over the last decade or so. So we really don't have a good sense on where India is on hunger, on nutrition, on rural poverty, and all other indicators that development economists are interested in. And it's been a major gap for us. And much of the SDG measurements and the metrics that are used are all using extrapolation from this old NSS survey round, which took place in 2011 and 12. So I'm really happy that CMIE has stepped up to fill this gap and provides us a peek into where this country is in consumer behavior and our ability to look at what's happening in terms of changes in diets, changes in nutrition, etc. And I strongly encourage continued investment in this area. And even as we think about CMIE and others such as CMIE stepping in and filling the gap, it's really important that we all collectively continue to emphasize to governments that they have to continue to play the historic role that they've had in collecting systematically nationally represented data across the country, and to do it across all sectors, and with particular importance to the rural sector in India. And that's a message that we should all be collectively giving to our governments, especially to the national government in India, and to keep that investment going. But in the meantime, I'm really happy that we've got the CPHS data to work with, and we'll continue to see how we can provide feedback to CMA on this. Let me briefly introduce our team today. Soumya Gupta was actually our first PhD graduating through the TCI program at Cornell. And she's done some enormously important work on gender empowerment and the relationship between gender and nutrition in India. And she's been publishing prolifically over the past 6-7 years, and it's becoming a rising star in this field. And I'm glad that she's going to lead up this discussion on gender and nutrition today. Vidya Vemireddy was also an early PhD from our program, and she did very innovative work looking at women's time allocation and the trade-off between time spent in agricultural activities relative to household activities and nutrition outcomes from that. And Vidya is now with IIM Ahmedabad and continues to be a very strong collaborator of ours. Andali Brahman got his PhD from IGIDR, where Mahendra Dev is from, and then has joined as a postdoctoral fellow since then, and is now a research associate with TCI in Ithaca at Cornell. And I'm glad to see there's a strong team today to tell you much more in detail about the research that we're doing on gender and nutrition, and looking at some of the COVID impacts on nutrition in India. So hand it back to you, Kaushik. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Prabhu. Soumya, over to you.
Thanks, Kaushik, and thanks, Prabhu, for that introduction. So today we'll be presenting some of our research at Tata-Cornell Institute around gender and nutrition, and also talking about what we've learned in terms of how the pandemic affected food and nutrition security at the household level and within the households. When we think about our focus on gender and food systems at TCI, one of the main reasons that we look at that is that gender matters for both agriculture and nutrition. We know that women play an important role in agriculture, and the roles and activities that women participate in, are very distinct from those that men participate in different seasons and in different parts of the agricultural cycle. So we want to be able to understand the roles and responsibilities and sort of the input that men and women have in different agricultural activities. At the same time, there's also gender inequality when it comes to engagement with markets. For instance, women's participation in the sale of produce or control over income or input in other decisions related to markets. And finally, agriculture and non-agricultural work determines a lot of how women's time is spent. And for nutritional outcomes for themselves, for their children, and for other members of their household, understanding how women's time use is being structured between agriculture and non-agriculture is equally important. And all of these differences for women's time and input and control over resources also get reflected in differences in rates of micronutrient deficiencies for men and for women. For some micronutrient deficiencies, we know that prevalence rates are higher for women as compared to men. For some of those, we know that they've also worsened over time. And so that's kind of why it takes us back to why we want to look at agriculture and nutrition from a gender lens. In TCI's food system framework, we have accounted for gender and nutrition at three different sort of nodes. One is we have looked at women's empowerment in agriculture. So we've measured women's and men's input and decision-making in different agricultural domains. For this, we've relied on the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which is also known as the WEA. And we have also adapted the WEA specifically to the Indian context or to the agricultural conditions in TCI's program locations. The next sort of outcome that we have looked at is diet diversity, which is basically a measure of the quality of food intake. And we have done this with very extensive diet surveys for for women and for households over multiple rounds, and using different recalls so that we can actually get at variations in day-to-day consumption. And finally, some of our work has also looked at specific micronutrient deficiencies in women, particularly iron deficiency, where we have established a significant relationship between women's empowerment and their iron deficiency status. And that has been based on multiple biomarkers that reflect iron status and sort of the intensity of iron deficiency in women. And across all of our work over the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years, what we found is that there are multiple pathways for improving women's nutrition. And our research sort of reflects evidence along several pathways. So for instance, women's empowerment, and within that, their input in production decisions or their participation in SAGs have been associated with significantly higher diet diversity scores. And when we look at production diversity at the household level, again, we find that cultivation of non-staples is a significant determinant of diet diversity. We're also finding that more than market diversity, it is more than production diversity, it is market integration that is turning out to be a very significant determinant of diet diversity and the quality of diets for women and their households. So whether we look at household purchases of non-staples in terms of quantity or in terms of expenditure, we find that that is a very, very strong driver of the quality of diets. And on the demand side, we're finding evidence for women's nutrition awareness, women's education levels relative to that of men's. All of these factors are strong drivers of food consumption at the individual level and at the household level. So today's seminar, we're actually going to focus, a lot of the results that we're going to present today are going to focus on markets as a source of diverse and nutritious foods for rural communities. So this is looking at markets as a source of food as opposed to markets as a source of income, which is usually how markets have been analyzed in sort of the food system space. And markets can influence food or food security or nutrition security by way of ensuring that diverse and nutritious foods are available to communities and that they are also affordable, which would mean that we are looking at both prices as well as the fluctuations or the price volatility over time to understand whether or not households have access to diverse foods and whether or not, or to what extent they can afford them. Now, the reason why this becomes important is because low quality diets have been identified as one of the leading factors behind the global burden of disease. And the fact that cost of healthy diets is extremely high has been established in the last 2 years for different geographies. And more than 3 billion people around the world right now cannot afford a least cost healthy diet. And about half of those live in South Asia. And so looking at the role that markets can play in ensuring nutrition security for households, and particularly for women, becomes relevant when we talk about how sustainable development goals are being reached or what progress is being made to reach those goals. Now, markets were also impacted everywhere when the COVID-19 pandemic began, and more so when countries responded with lockdowns of various intensities and of various durations. And so, for instance, in India, we know that there was a disruption in food access and availability. And this particularly hit the supply chains for non-staples, perishable non-staples. There were also at least short-term price hikes for most of these foods. And of course, on the demand side, there were, reports of losses of income across the board. And then if you look at how the government responded to, a lot of these sort of spillovers that happened because of the pandemic and because of the lockdown, one of the main ways in India was that there was an expansion of the ration that was provided through the PDS, or the public distribution system. So an expanded basket of rice and wheat and pulses was supposed to be provided. And we'll talk about what we found in terms of actually what households received or how much of that households received. But essentially, because it was still focused around cereals like rice and wheat, that again shifted consumption and demand towards low quality diets. And by low quality diets, what we mean is diets that were again very cereal centric and sort of heavy in these stable cereals like rice and wheat, as compared to nutritious non-staple foods. And we know that worsening food security will worsen the burden of malnutrition, which is as it is high, or which was as it is high even before the pandemic began. And we know that it's likely to disproportionately affect women and children. They are more vulnerable. They have seen higher rates of micronutrient deficiencies even before. So the pandemic is likely to have worsened that. And we show evidence for that later on in the seminar. So today, we're going to focus on two different aspects of the affordability of healthy diets. The first part of our presentation is going to look at our estimates for the cost of a healthy diet. And specifically by healthy diet, we are looking at what is the cost of meeting the dietary recommendations that were put forward by the Eat Lancet Commission in 2019. And so these were global dietary recommendations that I'll talk more about in a bit. So we're interested in looking at what that Eat Lancet diet costs for rural India. And we are also then looking at what do current diets look like right now, and where are current diets as compared to these recommended diets? How far away from the recommendations are we, and what will it take to get there? So that's going to be the first part of what we're going to talk about. After that, we're going to focus on the work that we've done around looking at the change in household food access and food affordability before and after the pandemic in India, and also how that translated to changes in the quality of diets within the household by looking at women's diet diversity and how that changed pre and post pandemic. So we've used two sets of data for all of this research work. One set is the primary data and one is the secondary data. And our primary data comes from a series of household surveys that TCI has been conducting in India over the last 4 to 5 years. TCI has a research program called TARINA, which stands for Technical Assistance and Research for Indian Nutrition and Agriculture. And TARINA is basically, the aim for TARINA was to design and implement nutrition sensitive food systems. And we work in Bihar, Odisha, and Uttar Pradesh, and in a total of 4 districts across those 3 states. And so over the last few years, we've done a series of surveys for the same set of households, looking at agriculture, nutrition, anthropometry, empowerment, and so on. So for the cost of diets study, however, we did an additional study called the Market Diversity Study, where we've basically collected data on the availability and the diversity of different food items and the prices of those food items. So we've looked at about 250 food items across 12 village level markets that are also known as HARTs. And this data was collected monthly for a period of 12 months. So we're able to look at how diversity and prices vary over time. It was collected in our 4 program districts. And the same time that we collected the market data, we also surveyed a subset of our Tarina households where we got information on women's dietary intake and on household food purchases. So for the same week that we have village level market data, we also have data on household food purchases and consumption. And so we expect that prices or availability at the market level would be reflected in household purchase behavior and women's food consumption behavior. So that's where the data comes for the cost of diets piece. The next set of data that we use for our COVID-19 and nutrition research is basically a panel. The first round was done in 2019 when we did a midline survey for Tarina. And the midline survey was for about 4,000 households across our program districts. That collected a lot of information on agriculture and nutrition related domains. In 2020, we did a survey of a subset of those households. So about 160 households were surveyed on phone during the lockdown in India in May of 2020. And so for these 155 households, we have data from 2019 and from 2020 for the same month. And for the purpose of this research, we have used the household food expenditures on different food groups and also the data on women's diet diversity to sort of analyze what the change was. So in addition to using primary data from TCI surveys, we've also used food expenditure data from CPHS. This was done mainly to validate our results using generating population level estimates. And so we've used expenditure data for the months of June 2018 to May 2019 at the state and national level, converted to per person per day in order to compare our cost of diet estimates to current cost of diets. And then for the COVID-19 piece, we have used expenditure data from CPHS for the months of March through June for 2 years, 2019 and 2020. And this we've used at the national, state, and district level. And the really good thing about this is that because we have disaggregated data as in national, state, and then sort of district level, we are able to identify how costs or how expenditures, etc., not just change at these levels, but also how that change varied at these different levels, which kind of again points to this need to look at subnational estimates, because the markets that communities are engaging with and the prices that they're paying are very, very local. So it's more useful to have that local level data. So I'll quickly talk a little bit about the methods that we have used. So the cost of diets essentially is, so the cost of diet requires 3 things. It requires a recommended intake of different food groups. So like these many grams of cereals should be consumed every day, these many grams of pulses or meats or dairy and so on. So the recommended diet that we work with is the Eat Lancet diet, which was put forward in 2019. And it's a diet that provides about 2,500 kilocalories per person per day. It's rich in micronutrient foods like fruits and vegetables, whole grains. It has very little amounts of red meat and processed foods, and it has about moderate amounts of seafood and poultry. And so we work with these food groups that the Eat Lancet diet was specified with. So starchy staples, pulses, fruits, dark green leafy vegetables, other vegetables, meat, fish, poultry, dairy, sweeteners, and oils. So that's the first part of what we need to estimate a cost of diets. The second thing that we need is for each of these food groups, we need a price. And the prices that we use come from TCI's market diversity study. And these are the most recent prices that have been used to estimate cost of healthy diets so far. All the other analysis that has estimated the cost of healthy diets for India, whether it's based on Eat Lancet or whether it's based on India's own food-based dietary guidelines, have used 2011 prices, which are now 1 decade old. So we have recent prices. We also have sub-national level prices because we've got them from actual village level markets. And we have seasonal prices because we've collected them over a period of 12 months. And so we're able to look at what costs of diets look like at a subnational level over time. And therefore, we're also able to look at how that cost is disaggregated across different food groups. So we kind of know how these different food groups are behaving in terms of prices and fluctuations in prices over time. And then finally, the prices are adjusted for edible portions using these edible portion factors that are used as a standard in the literature. And I can talk about that more at the end if anyone needs more information. And so we have a cost of diet, which is basically the recommended intake for each food group multiplied by the price for each food group. And then you kind of sum up that cost across all food groups. And we use two kinds of prices for our estimates. One is a minimum price, which means it's the cost of the cheapest food item in each food group. So if a cereal food group has 4 kinds of cereals, the minimum price for cereals will be the price of the cheapest cereal in that food group. And similarly, we have an average price per food group, which is the average price across all food items in that food group. And so we have estimated both minimum and average, but for this presentation, we are mostly sticking to minimum cost estimates and talking about those. So the second thing we wanted to do as part of this work was to look at what is the cost of current diets. And for that, we rely on household expenditure. So household expenditure on purchased foods from TCI's market study, and also household expenditure from the CPHS at the national and state level. And finally, because we have a cost of recommended diet and we have a cost of actual diet, we look at the difference between the two to sort of look at what the deficit is. And then we disaggregate that by food group to see which are the food groups where the deficit is really concentrated in. For the COVID and nutrition piece, we are looking at changes in household food affordability. So we look at changes in household food expenditures using both TCI and CPHS data. We look at changes in total expenditures and then also disaggregated by the same food groups that I talked about a while ago, so that we're able to look at which food groups were affected more relative to others. And here our focus is really to look at the sort of differential impact that the pandemic had on staples versus non-staple food groups, and what that means for nutritional outcomes in terms of calorie versus micronutrient security. And then at the individual level, when we want to look at how changes in household food access translated to the intra-household space, we are looking at differences in women's diet diversity scores. So diet diversity score is a sum of the food groups that a woman has reported having consumed in the previous 24 hours. So we use a total of 10 food groups. And so if the woman consumes any food from each of those food groups, she gets a score of 1 for each food group that was consumed. And then you sum up all the food groups and you get a diet diversity score. And we look at how the diet diversity score changed between 2019 and 2020. And when the diet diversity score is disaggregated by each food group, then you can get at the proportion of women who consumed it in each round. And so we can look at how those proportions changed as well. And the diet diversity data comes from the TCI surveys. So I will hand it over to Vidya now, who will walk you through the cost of diets results.
Thanks, Soumya. Can we move to the next slide? Just talking about the cost of diets piece here. If you look at Soumya has already given a sense of how we calculated these cost of diets, both the minimum and average cost. And so the chart here basically looks at the cost of current as well as the recommended diets. All the estimates are in per person per day and in USD. So if you look at this third bar over here, we find that on average, it would have cost an individual at least about $3.3 per day to meet the Eat Lancet recommendations that were given. If the person buys the cheapest food item in each of the food group in the weekly hard markets in each of the districts, which is yearly. Now, the cost of Eat Lancet diet exceeds about $5 per day if the person chooses to purchase the average cost within each of the food groups. Now, the average cost of Eat Lancet diet based on minimum and average prices is varying between now $3.3 per person per day to approximately $5.32 per person per day. Both these estimates, as shown in the chart here, are greater than the World Bank estimates of $1.9 and India specific poverty line, which is about $1.8. Now, in comparison, if you look at the first two bars on this graph, which is measuring the actual cost in terms of what they are actually consuming in terms of purchasing now, the current behavior of it, not the recommended one. We see that they're spending approximately $0.62 with the minimum cost and about $1 per person per day with the average cost estimates. That is lower than the population level expenditure, and so we'll talk about that. A comparison of actual costs to the minimum estimate of the Eat Lancet actually gives us indicates that individuals are unable to meet even the lower end in value terms of the recommended intakes, suggesting that the consumption of all food groups falls short of the average intake. Now, the two food groups that account for the largest share of this minimum cost, if you look at the disaggregated in terms of food groups within these bars, are actually meat, fish, egg, which is approximately 30%, and about dairy, which is 20%. In the case of dairy, this corresponds to its share approximately 18.8% in the recommended daily intake. Just moving ahead to the next slide, if you look at the seasonality of these deficits, we see very interesting picture, right? So from here in this chart, we can see from August to May, which is charted here, and we're actually measuring the deficit of what is recommended and what is the current diet pattern. So in the divergence of these costs is depicted in the chart here. The monthly deficit in cost of actual consumption relative to what is recommended. Based on the minimum price, now we're not looking at average prices here in this chart, we're looking at minimum price within the food group estimate. The gap in diet cost was as much as about $2.4 per person per day in August. And as you can see, it changes, and this increases to nearly approximately $3 in November and December, and exceeds it by April. Now, parallel trends can be seen with average prices also. We have not depicted that here, but where households spend nearly $5 less person per day than the cost of Eat Lancet diets. Now, if we move to actually what happens for the next slide, in order for individuals to meet the Eat Lancet recommendations, the greatest increase in spending is required. As you can see here, we have done it for fruits, dairy, and meat, fish. If you look at the lines presented here, we can see that the spending is to meet the recommendations of the Eat Lancet. The spending is required in meat, fish, poultry, fruits, and dairy. It's also unlikely that the shortfall can be met by only own production estimates adequately, right? If you look at the minimum cost, the deficit in spending is 90 cents per person per day on dairy and 50 cents. Now, when we look at cost estimates from average prices, these differences reach 0.96 each for fruits and dairy and exceed 1 per person per day for meat, fish, poultry. These results are very much in line with the expenditure by about $1 on average on each dairy protein foods that are required to reach healthy diets in South Asia, which was a report by FAO in 2020. The deficit for MFP is highest, as you can see, in October, December, and fruits. For fruits during February and April periods. These are also the months when, if we know that the average prices for these food groups typically peak. In contrast, the shortfall in expenditure on staples like cereals and pulses is relatively low. Moving to the next slide. When we analyze the seasonality aspect of this in terms of the Eat Lancet diets, seasonality in the cost of wheat lancet diets is evident. If we look at in June, per person per day estimates are approximately $2.9. And in November, they increased to, so in June to about 3.5, and in November it goes to 3.7. These amounts to an increase about 22% and 28% respectively. Now, the fact that the gap between the cost of recommended and actual diets is also the highest in same months when the cost of the Eat Lancet diet peaks indicates that the households are actually spending the least on current diets in these same months, presumably being driven by two factors. So the first of these relates to the prices of the food groups. We find that the variation in minimum and average food group prices from the period which we're looking at, which is July 2018 to May 2019 relative to their prices. While perishables like fruits and vegetables have lower absolute prices, they're marked by greater month-to-month volatility. So they're very highly seasonal and volatile relative to more expensive non-staples like meat, poultry, and dairy products. The months of November and April, when the minimum cost of Eat Lancet diet was about 20% more costly, are also the months when prices of food groups are most volatile. So another relevant factor besides the prices that I just mentioned is the stage of the agricultural production cycle also. The peaks and variations of average prices that occur in the months of October, November, March, April correspond exactly to the time just before the beginning of the harvest season. So what we find is that it's likely that both supplies and the household incomes are low at the end of lean season, contributing to price volatility and lower purchases respectively. Moving to the slide, we, on now actually validating our, TCI Terina sites, where we estimate these costs, we validate those with the CPHS data. And here we're looking at the food expenditure data of Eat Lancet food groups using CPHS on average rural households in the country. If you look at the measures here for the period June 2018 to May 2019, it's equivalent to approximately $1.7 per person per day. Now, the cost of diets in all three of our program states, which is UP, Bihar, and Odisha, as shown in the previous graph methods, was lower than the national average. Rural households were spending at the very least half of the minimum cost of Eat Lancet diets and 1/4 of its average cost. Such a deficit is not seen for all the food groups. We have some variation in terms of TCI Terina sites and CPHS. So for cereals and for vegetables, we see that the CPHS estimates are greater. But for all other food groups, we are in line with the TCI Terina and CPHS have almost similar estimates in terms of the validation of the results. Moving on, I think Soumya would then talk about the next COVID-19 and nutrition piece, the results from that.
Thanks, Vidya. Yeah, so I will now talk about what we found in terms of changes to nutrition security at the household and individual level, pre and post COVID. So one of the things is that when we view CPHS data, we find that if we compare monthly food expenditures, from March to June in 2019 and then 2020, there was significant decline in 2020 at all levels. So at the national level, at the state level, and at the district level. But because we're able to also then look at 3 different states and then 4 different districts, we find that there's a lot of heterogeneity in how the decline in these food expenditures or the changes in the food expenditures played out. And the other thing that we note is that when we just compare expenditures from March of 2020 to June of 2020, which is before the lockdown and then, towards the post-lockdown, we find that at the national and state level, the food expenditures actually recovered to March 2020 levels by the time you get to June of 2020. But that was not the case at the district level. So district level expenditures were lower to begin with anyway, and the sort of the decline in them was to a much greater extent, and they did not recover even by the end of June of last year. In some of the cases, we do find that expenditures did increase, in fact, but when I go to the next slide, which I will right now, we find that the food groups that are contributing to those increases were food groups that did see short-term price increases. So in a separate DCI study, we have looked at retail prices for different food groups in these states and in like tier 1 and tier 2 cities in these states. And so the increases sort of correspond to the increases in prices that we found there. And of course, because we have district level data for all these different states, we also see that there's just a lot of heterogeneity in how these food groups or the expenditure on food groups varied. But what's really interesting to note is that if you look at food groups like meats and fish, or eggs, or fruits, and even vegetables in some of the districts and the states that we're focusing on, there was a consistent decline in expenditures. And these are all non-staples, which are either rich in proteins or in micronutrients. The other thing is that even if expenditure increased, for instance, on dairy in some of the districts or on potatoes and onions in some of the states, it doesn't necessarily translate into an increase in the quantity that was purchased or the quantity that was available for consumption within the household. Because we know that a lot of this also was just correlated with price hikes. And so higher expenditure could have actually meant that the quantities being purchased were actually lower. And we do see that for things like potatoes and onions at the state level. From DCI's own panel data of the midline and the phone survey, we find that weekly food expenditures fell by about 11% between May 2019 and 2020. And a lot of this decline, again, was concentrated in non-staples like meats, eggs, dark green leafy vegetables, and other fruits and vegetables. And how this decline translates into changes in food consumption and quality of diets within the household. For that, we look at women's diet diversity score, and we find that the diversity of women's diets had reduced in all 4 districts, between 2019 and 2020, and it was significantly lower in Munger, which was in Bihar, and Kandhamal in Orissa. When we disaggregate the diet diversity score to look at the proportion of women who consume different food groups, we find that non-staples were being consumed by fewer women. So vitamin A-rich foods, other fruits, other vegetables were all being consumed by fewer women in most of the districts. And when we did the phone survey, there was a lot of sort of qualitative information that the respondents shared with us, about things like the quantity of, let's say, pulses or the quantity of meats had been reduced, in some cases halved after the lockdown or after the pandemic as compared to before. And that even the preparations were being sort of watered down, like the lentils or the dals were more watered down and so on. So it does indicate that we know that expenditures declined. We know that that decline was centered around non-staples. And from the consumption side, we're also seeing that there was a decline in the quality of diets and in the proportion of women who were consuming a lot of these non-staple food groups. So to tie in the results from these 2 studies, one is that we know that even before the pandemic, healthy diets, or at least the Eat Lancet diet, cost about $3 per person per day, which is higher than the poverty lines as Vidya discussed. And we know that the deficit is there for nearly all food groups at the district level. And most of the deficit is concentrated in 3 non-staple food groups: meats, dairy, and fruits. And these are food groups that are unlikely to be met by households' own production. So households likely do rely on markets to source these kinds of foods. Then what we find is that with COVID and with the lockdown, there was a differential impact of the pandemic on calories versus other micronutrients. So we know that PDS was expanded. Our phone survey indicates that most households got the extra rations for rice and wheat. They didn't really get them for pulses. And so it looks like household accessibility to food did suffer, expenditures did fall. And we know that a lot of that was in nutrient-dense non-staples. And women's diets within those households are also significantly lower in terms of diversity as compared to before. And again, fewer women were consuming micronutrient-rich non-staples like fruits and vegetables. And so this also points to the fact that when we're talking about the lockdown and how it has impacted food and nutrition security, we really want to distinguish between calorie hunger and sort of micronutrient hunger or micronutrient deficiencies, which are likely to have been worsened even as calorie intake was not as adversely affected as it was for these non-staples. So we know that for food systems to be able to ensure food and nutrition security for rural communities, we do need to be able to provide healthy diets at an affordable price in low and middle income countries. A lot of what this requires is a convergence of policies so that nutrition security is sort of at the center of the objectives in different domains, whether it's agriculture, whether it's health, whether it's education and others. And so from an agricultural point of view, a lot of the agricultural policy in India so far has been centered around the rice and wheat staples, and diversifying away from those diversifying cropping systems, away from sort of cereal-centric policy would enable both increases in incomes for households and also, sort of contribute to the sort of local supply of these non-staples. Markets also need to be strengthened. Need to be strengthened in terms of supply chains for perishable non-staples, so investments in cold storage infrastructure, linking farmers to markets. All of those kinds of investments are also required. What we find is that the pandemic has, adversely affected nutrition security, and it's likely to have worsened the already existing malnutrition burdens. Although the PDS was expanded, it was, the diversified component of PDS, which was the pulses, wasn't really received by most of the households. And so the PDS diversification, even outside of the pandemic, would need to include more nutrition-rich foods. Direct benefit transfers would also ensure that households are able to access healthy food at times like the pandemic, which is sort of an exogenous shock that affects both supply and demand side factors. And then when safety nets are being designed at such times, it is important to sort of have a gender responsive lens to them to increase coverage and to sort of ensure that we are especially targeting, let's say, women or pregnant and lactating women. We know that Anganwadi centers closed down, midday meals were also halted, and in our survey, less than 30% of eligible households said that they received any kind of food rations from the Anganwadi centers even after the closure. And finally, a lot of TCI's field research is centered around the need for better data systems to track the role of food markets in ensuring diverse, nutritious foods for rural communities. And I'll hand over to Andaleep, who will talk more about that now.
Thanks, Soumya and Vidya. So what my job here is to tell what all we couldn't do or what we want to do. So I'll pick up from where Soumya left. What she said was to understand the linkages between agriculture, gender-sensitive food systems, to understand gender food systems and how to connect agriculture and to nutritional outcomes, we need to have better data systems. And that's where CPHS kinds of filled in our need for these work that we were interested in. So the high frequency wave of consumption and income that CPHS has allowed us to understand so many things that we didn't know in the last 10 years, almost a decade, that NSS hasn't been. The high frequency monthly, where you can follow the same set of households every 3 months, has allowed us to understand how incomes, diet, employment structure had changed. And more specifically for the recent 16 months, we also understood how COVID affected livelihoods, food systems in general. For us at TCI, where we study food systems, consumption expenditure kind of comes as the most needed data set that we wanted to study. We could find out how consumption patterns of essential and non-essential items has changed, how livelihoods and incomes have changed. So we've learned a lot, and Vidya and Soumya presented, which kind of validated the field work that we were doing, but also used all this to kind of create some sort of research agenda on how to understand these things in the absence of better data systems. So what in the next slide, what I'm going to do is talk about things we could have done, things that we want to do, and which allows us to understand the food system better and also kind of create a relationship with CMI to get to understand these things, the food systems in general better. So what we do study in food systems, first of all, is access to food and its affordability, and consumption provides us the information. Where we kind of can do better is a more disaggregation of food products, because food consumption lumped together probably doesn't tell us what people are consuming, how much amount are they consuming, and how much are they paying for these food products. What we get from the consumer surveys here is the expenditure of food items. Sometimes disaggregated, sometimes aggregated, but unlike NSS, I mean, NSS kind of all of us come to that as a benchmark because that has allowed us to understand consumption. But here, there's this richness of data, but probably we can make it more rich by adding quantity as well. To give you an example, at this moment, the price of meat, I mean, meat here is, I'm talking about goat meat or mutton in Bangalore is 750 rupees, and in Bombay, it's around 1,500 rupees a kilo. So if someone is reporting household expenditure, probably it hides these variation in prices spatially. Also, the amount consumed, we probably cannot get through these data. And to understand food consumption better, whether be it the cost of diet that we calculate, or how post-COVID the consumption of different food items changed, this is something which we miss. This also affects how we understand dietary diversity and nutrient intake, which is the intermediate parts of nutrition, if you want to connect that link. So these are some of the things which are missing, which probably we want to do because they delete the actual consumption that households did and the quality parameters to understand how food systems are working. Given this presentation was about gender, we want to understand more about the women's empowerment and agency in a household, which means how the food is allocated within a household. So they could, I mean, we can kind of add a module on maybe for representative women, how her diets have changed, how consumption of quantity of different foods, because that kind of allows us to understand empowerment and agency of women, which is an essential part of food systems. The other thing which we work, and a lot of researchers here probably would be interested in knowing how these state institutions, which affect how income structure of the household is through PDS, for example, for food, or NREGK, how much these households are earning from those sources or getting transfers of food from PDS, is something we kind of wanted to dig deep into, but probably couldn't get enough data to look into this. The connection in the food system, an important connection in the food system, is how incomes affect food security. So, and given we are focusing on the rural households, what we miss here sometimes is actually how farm income is cultivated. Farm income is calculated, because the data, to what it seems to us right now, is more for attuned to an urban households or households in general, rather than particular activities that farmers or farming households are involved in. For example, we probably don't get fine idea of how much income is from cultivation wages, non-agricultural wages, livestock, and other agricultural farm activities, because India is still being 67%, according to census, a rural population. We want to understand those income household structure of the at the level of a farm a little better, which with not a lot of effort, probably give it CPHS, the users of CPHS more information on how to understand this. We have been talking about doubling farm income in India for almost a decade now, but in the absence of actually the right set of data, we are not able to see it. So cultivation is an important income source which we are missing. Similarly, agriculture and non-agriculture wages. Soumya started a presentation and with saying that women in general engage in different economic activities than men. Through greater disaggregation of data in terms of the kind of jobs women are employed in, one can match it to the national industrial occupation, or classification of occupation gives us the idea of the kind of jobs people are interested in. Industry job security probably again better helps us answer, okay, the food intake of the household is low or high. Probably the employment structure of the household helps us understand. One thing which not a lot of people have used, I haven't seen paper much except for one, is on something that CPHS does collect, is the time use data, which is very useful for us because it's at the individual level to understand how gendered time use affects child outcomes. But yet we feel that it's kind of not attuned to rural activity. For example, it's not delineated in detail of how much time a woman or a man spends on cooking, childcare, and other household activities. The variable that is there is probably more in general, how much do you spend on household activities, probably doesn't help us delineate these things, which is of actually immense use for people studying gender nutrition linkages. So that's where I would kind of leave it and open a conversation around it. So this is in connection with what Soumya and Vidya presented. We wanted to open up a debate in terms of how well we can understand these linkages, given the data structure that we have, given how we can push the data structure further, as CPHS has been doing this far. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Andalib, Soumya, Vidya, and Prabhu, thank you so much for this presentation. I'll invite Professor Mahendra Dev to please give his comments.
Thank you, Kaushik. Good evening, and thanks to TCI and Prabhu and CMI and Mahesh Vyas for inviting me for this webinar. And as you know, the TCI led by Prabhu Pingali, they have been doing a lot of excellent work on agriculture and nutrition. So I've read the two papers, of course, not completely, the major part of the papers. They're quite good and, of course, timely in the context of COVID and also for the medium-term policies. So in my comments, first, I will talk about data, particularly the expenditure data, the official one first. As Prabhu mentioned, on data, we have to collectively push for better timely data from the government, better untimely data. Because if you see the expenditure data, as you mentioned, the 10-year-old, I mean, it's not acceptable. But even that data, there are some problems. Dr. Rangarajan and myself compared NSS and National Accounts statistics data. So what is the difficulty is that the difference in India between the NSS and NS consumption has been widening over time. Because generally there are differences between NSS consumption data and national accounts, where you calculate GDP, the expenditure data. But the difference was about 10% in 1970s, but it has widened to nearly 70% in 2017-18, which was not released, but the estimates show. So in other words, only the NSS estimates, only about 32% of the national account statistics estimates. So this is true for both food and non-food items. So one has to see why this gap is widening and which is the correct one, national accounts data or NSS data. But of course, government should have released the 2017-18 survey. But recently there is a PLFS survey 2019-20. Some people are using that data for estimating the poverty estimates. But if you see, they give only one-shot question there. So last 30 days are what is the household expenditure. So there are no details about the commodities and others. So that is, I don't think that's useful for estimating poverty estimates. And on poverty and malnutrition, Prabhu mentioned that both they're not declining that much compared to the growth. But if you see, poverty decline is faster than the malnutrition decline. Particularly poverty decline in 2004-05 to 2011-12 was very high poverty decline, whereas malnutrition and the stunting and other numbers are slower decline. Coming to the data presented in these two papers, primary data, of course, I don't have major the issues with that. Then the CPHS data, of course, is a very valuable data, as because particularly during COVID time or before, where we don't have official data, this is filling up the gap, and a lot of detailed data is available. So I mean, I've not looked at the CPHS data and sample, but some others commented, like John Drees and others. So this is more to provoke Mahesh Vyas than TCI. They said it is consumer pyramid household survey was biased towards better off households, and the bias was rising over time. In fact, a concern was raised whether sampling is too focused on main streets within towns and villages where the better off may reside. So it underrepresents the interiors, like the poor households. So that's one of the criticisms about the CPHS data. So the basic argument is it's towards more higher income groups it's capturing, because it is concentrating more on main street rather than the interiors. Of course, Mahesh Vyas has replied, but again, there was other reply. But maybe they said, of course, the CMI said that they will take care by next year, all this criticism. But the problem, circular random sampling, which includes all households by going around a village, for instance, it's becoming a popular method than a linear random sample where you may collect only along a single street. So that may be one of the ways to have interior people also. But of course, given this one criticism, the CPH data is very valuable, and it also panel data, and many people are using in the absence of NSS data. The two papers use primary data, and for validation, of course, they use CPHS of CMI. The first paper is on cost of achieving the Eat Lancet recommended diets. As they mentioned, there are earlier studies by IFPRI and all, but they have become old. Of course, IFPRI study shows that Eat Lancet, if you see the least cost, around 57% in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and around 38% in South Asia, they're below the estimated least cost of Eat Lancet. But the present study, the presented one, is it looks at the actual cost, unlike the cost of diet and those things, and also sub-nation level it looks. And third thing, of course, the interesting thing is about the seasonality, because that's quite interesting, the seasonality, the variations in seasonality. Of course, conclusions, I don't have any major issues here. The global dietary recommendation cost $3.3 per day, but the current diets are lagging with the respective average recommended intake of all food groups. For example, the gap, particularly in primary survey, is much higher than of course, the CPHS data, which is about $1.7 or so. Of course, I expected also the biggest deficit is in the three non-staple food groups: meats, dairy, and fruits. So it also confirms some of the conclusions of earlier studies, particularly on the cost of diet, which is difficult to follow for the developing countries, particularly. But also, apart from the Eat Lancet, there are also different countries have their own diets, plans and all. For example, Purnima was asking the NIN study on cost of the diets they have. So what is the cost of NIN diets, National Institute of Nutrition diets, or some other countries they may have at national level. So apart from the Eat Lancet, I don't know, they're collected from different nations or thing, but that is one area where one can look at those things. The second study is on COVID impact. It compares March, June 2019 and 2020 with 2020. Basically, it examines the food access, household, food access and household food access, and changes of women's diet diversity pre and post COVID. But it may be noted that even in 2019, the economy was not doing well with 4% of GDP. But the malnutrition numbers are also high, even in 2019-20. NFHS, some of the released data show that it is still very high. So COVID, what happened, the further deteriorated in 2020 with already high malnutrition levels in 2019. So we have to keep this in mind, already high levels, but still more deterioration. So the primary survey for this one is COVID impact is 155 households, and it has 7-day recall period for 2020. For 2019 survey, it has monthly survey and converted to it weekly. But it may be noted that 7-day recall and 30-day recall, monthly recall has a lot of differences the way household report expenditures. So this comparison one has to be careful. The monthly recall, although we divide it into 4 weeks, but the household what they give will be different. The paper shows that there is a decline in food expenditure in the selected districts more than the national and state average. For example, the Orissa and other districts. However, there is net, one has to see those states because the migrant workers have gone back. So that could be one reason, Bihar, Odisha, and other states, why the expenditures are much lower there as compared to the state average and national average. And also, you look at only food expenditures, but it could have been better. Total expenditure also could have, examined. Another point, of course, is women's diet diversity. As it has declined in all the 4 districts, but it is not a significant decline in Kalahandi and Maharajganj. Statistically, it's not significant. So between 2019 and 2020. So what are the reasons for this, not decline in these 2 districts? And also household food expenditures on meat, poultry, and fish has increased in 2 Odisha districts. I don't know, this is surprising. What is the reason for increase in this? So, but in general, the findings in this paper more or less confirm the findings of their other studies, and also the pandemic had devastating impact on incomes and food and nutrition security for informal workers, and particularly for women. So this is about data and the findings. So now I come to my views on policies, because where I work on these policies for agriculture and nutrition. The agriculture economists generally restrict to the policies relating to farm sector, but you have to look at even the macro policies, because there's need to look at the fiscal, monetary, trade, tariff, exchange rate. So they have direct and indirect impacts on agriculture and nutrition. Next, on diversification. In the 2 papers, they emphasize the diversification of cropping patterns and diversification of diets. There are 2 agricultures in India. One is cereal based, and the other cereal, particularly rice, wheat based, and the other is non-cereal based. So government policies have been biased towards cereals. In fact, I was also responsible for giving more MSP, minimum support prices, for rice and wheat, and also procurement there. So there is a need to shift from rice wheat centric policies to millets and other diversification of cropping patterns. As you know, India had green revolution and became self-sufficient in food grains, but it was only wheat and rice revolution. But it led to waterlogging, soil erosion and groundwater depletion. And even government policies like price and water policies tend to focus on rice and wheat. And as many studies show that, three crops, rice, wheat, sugarcane, corner about 80% of irrigated water in the country. So rice and wheat cultivation in Punjab and Haryana is not sustainable because of groundwater depletion. So there is a need to promote, millets, pulses, and oil seeds. And also water use efficiency is also low in India. India uses 2-3 times the water used to produce 1 ton of grain as compared to, like China, Brazil, and USA. So water use efficiency also, if you go to more diversification, it can be achieved. Another thing is, of course, also climate resilient. Also, if you diversify, for example, pulses are less water intensive, but also useful for soil fertility and others, the climate change resilient crops. So there are 3 types of diversification needed within crop sector to allied sector, and within crop sector to millets, fruits and other things, the oil seeds, and to allied sector, the livestock and others, and also rural non-farm. See, the NABARD study says only 22% of incomes from, for rural households come from agriculture. So rural non-farm is equally important. And also this paper also suggests we have to develop markets. Markets, a lot of emphasis on that. So market integration is important on diet diversity. But if you see some of the studies, they show that the variation across mandis in the country is very high compared to many other developing countries. So the price variation persists over time, and district fixed effects could not explain, part of the variation. So this is because of the local factors and other things. So one has to have more market integration. Some of the reforms are needed. On availability of non-staple foods, we all know, it was also mentioned, we have to go beyond farming and develop value chain comprising the wholesaling, warehousing, logistics, processing and retailing, and particularly useful for non-staples. And majority of the poor in India are not able to afford healthy, diversified and affordable diets in spite of availability in the markets. However, sometimes even availability is a problem. For example, even in rural areas, we find more chips packets and biscuits than fresh food. And even if they are available, fruits and vegetables and animal sourced foods are expensive to buy for a common woman or man. The rise of the food systems approach, also brings the need for reduction in food loss and waste as one of the potential solutions to achieve food and nutrition security. Because post-harvest loss, if you control, maybe food availability, the non-staple crops may be much higher. Of course, one of the successful examples of value chain that helped smallholders and also women and consumers is Amul model, created by the father of white revolution, Dr. Varghese Kurian. So millions of milk producers supply milk in, more than 150,000 dairy cooperative societies across the country. So this is the one model where the non-staples can have, of course, fruits and vegetables have much more perishable, but one can have this value chain approach. In advanced countries, they want to reduce animal sourced foods because of unsustainability and increase in emissions. But the animal sourced foods are still needed for developing countries. For instance, in per capita consumption of meat is still below 10 kilograms in India as compared to 60 to 70 kilograms in advanced countries. So there is still scope for consumption of animal sourced foods in India. So, but we have to do this without damaging the sustainability objective. Of course, the policies on inclusiveness also important, focus on small and marginal farmers. The eastern sector, like the TCI is focusing, Bihar, Odisha, and also Jharkhand. And on women's empowerment and nutrition, of course, the pandemic, the study has shown that affected women much more than men. But regarding their livelihoods, if we see the participation rates for rural women, declined drastically in recent years. In fact, it declined from 48.5% in 2004-5 to 23% in the latest 2017-18. In fact, countries like Bangladesh have much higher women's participation rates. So pandemic has affected the women's employment much more and incomes, which are already low in the pre-pandemic period. So women-centric policies on agriculture and nutrition are required. Agriculture index, of course, gives the women empowerment index. Also, our Spandan data, the Spandan data of IJDR, our institute also, among other things, the women's empowerment and the diet diversity are related. It also shows. Among other things, indicates kitchen gardens help in increasing the nutrition of women. Lastly, on government programs, at the macro level, to tackle the pandemic impact, government has used fiscal and monetary policies. It also includes increase in allocations under PDS and cash transfers to women. But one criticism of fiscal policy is that it is more providing credit than direct stimulus. And various studies have shown that the allocations to food and cash transfers were not sufficient. They were useful, but compared to the problem, they were not sufficient. There was a severe disruption of public services, including nutrition-related services, midday meals, Anganwadis, and schools were closed. So studies also show that non-COVID health services also declined, like child immunization, antenatal care, outpatient attendance also declined. So all this have impact on the nutrition of women particularly and children. The paper on COVID impact says that in PDS, non-staple should be introduced, more micronutrient thing. That suggestion is well taken, but one can think of biofortification of staples. Also, one can use, for example, biofortified rice can also be, used in PDS. The Harvest Plus program, yes, as you know, is promoting biofortification, and it's planning to cover 1 billion by 2030. So that is one where you can cover more population with even staples also. But the suggestion that non-staples like pulses and other things should be included, eggs in midday meal schools and all. To conclude, on data, of course, there are some limitations acknowledged by the studies, because the primary studies are based on 160 households in one paper and 155 households. It's a small sample, but of course, it is validated with CPHS data. But CPHS data itself has to be validated, with national surveys like NFHS and other surveys. So one has to keep in mind some of the limitations of the data. Of course, more studies are required covering different areas in the country to examine the regional and other disparities in agriculture. Of course, using CPHS data, one can see. Andalip has given some of the things. Even time use survey recently NSS has brought out, so that can be one addition. Lastly, I enjoyed reading these two studies of TCI, which are important additions to the literature. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mahendradev. I'd like to bring our presenters back on if they'd like to respond to any of the points that were made by Professor Mahendradev. Prabhu, Soumya, Vidya, Andalip, the floor is yours.
I'll probably just respond to a few of the points. So one of the points was that we converted our monthly food expenditures to weekly, and I completely take the point that there is a lot of difference in what is recalled for a monthly food expenditure and what's recalled for a weekly food expenditure, especially for things like consumption of meats or other such foods. So that is something that we do sort of acknowledge in the paper as well, and we take that point that they don't, just dividing the monthly by 4 does not give us the same as the weekly. There was another point that Professor Mahendradev made, which was that the diet diversity scores in the 2 districts in Orissa, although they did decline, the decline was not significant as compared to what we see in Bihar and in Uttar Pradesh. So I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that what we've seen throughout the TCI surveys in these 2 districts in Orissa is that diet diversity for women in general has been higher over here as compared to what we're finding in Bihar and UP. So in Bihar and UP, the average diet diversity scores for women are between 3 and 4, based on a 24-hour recall, whereas in Orissa, it's between 5 and 6. So if you look at the actual magnitude of change, the change is similar, or the decline in the diet diversity score in Orissa districts is also very similar to the magnitude of decline that we're seeing in the other 2 districts. But I think because the base diet diversity scores themselves are higher, that's probably why the difference is not showing up as a sort of significant difference. The other reason could also be that we, through the Tarina program, know that there are a lot more households that have kitchen gardens in Orissa as compared to Munger and Maharajganj in Bihar and UP. And it's likely that the kitchen gardens could have played a role in sort of, buffering some of the shocks that happened at the market level for availability of seasonal fruits and vegetables. So I think those could be some of the things that are going on with the data that's coming out of Orissa. So that's what I wanted to say, but if the others want to add something, then please do.
Thank you,
Let me
Soumya.
just, Kaushik, I just want to make one comment, more general, since Mahendradev is here and he's been so active in the agriculture policy community in India for decades. And Purnima Menon is also online here, and she's been really active on the nutrition community, nutrition agenda and nutrition policy in India. And I want to re-emphasize the issue that all of us are trying to come up with strong analysis that helps the policy community to think through better policies for addressing food security, nutrition, and rural poverty. But we've all been reluctant to call the government on the data front. We've all been reluctant to say, hey, it's your job to come to invest in better data and better data systems. And by not doing that, we are kind of, we're stuck in whatever poor data we've got. And despite all the good efforts that CMI is doing and the really important role it's playing in filling the gap, there is no substitute for strong long-term government investment in data systems for India. And I would call for Mahendradev, Purnima Menon, and like-minded influential people in India to form a coalition for better data systems for India, and to keep advocating for this and not to stop talking about it. And they keep pushing it, because if that doesn't happen, we're going to lose out a lot. So let me make that as a final plea from my side.
Thank you, Prabhu. With everybody's permission, I would also like to bring Mahesh Vyas into the discussion. Mahesh is the MD and CEO of CMI. Mahesh has been here for the entire presentation. Mahesh is also the person that's responsible for Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. He's the chief architect. He knows the survey better than anybody else. Andalip had talked a little bit about improvements, a wish list of things that you would like to see in CPHS, which Mahesh, I think you may like to respond to. Professor Mahendra Dev has brought up an issue that we've addressed, but perhaps requires addressing again, which are the comments that have been made by Jean Drees and Anmol Samanchi and others. Mahesh, over to you. We'd love to hear your thoughts both on the points made by the authors as well as the discussant.
Okay. Thanks, Kaushik. And I enjoyed watching the presentation, hearing the discussion, and all the presenters. So it is a wonderful presentation, number one. And thank you, Prabhu, for all the kind words you said about the work that we do. We do have limitations, and we will strive to keep improving what we are doing. That, of course, does not in any way take away the point that you made that the pressure on the government should be on for them to produce data. I don't think I'm amiss in saying this, that our production of the data has put tremendous pressure on them. So that was not exactly an intended objective, but nevertheless, it is good that we began our effort into putting out this data quite early, and the government has reacted in presenting its PLFS, which is also a relatively fast frequency output on employment and unemployment. So I think we are putting our own kind of pressures on them. I'm also happy to share with all of you that I have been interacting a lot with the Ministry of Statistics to discuss how we conduct the survey and how many of the things that we do can be adopted by them. And they are very appreciative of the inputs that we give them. I've had many rounds of discussion with them. In fact, an entire team from MOSPI spent 3 days in Bombay with us to understand how we go about doing the survey. So there's a lot of exchange which is happening, which is very healthy, which is, I hope is also going to be very fruitful. The comments by Jean Drees are quite welcome. I'm quite happy to hear, not happy, but I quite welcome what they are saying, and I take their comments very seriously. And as I've responded to them, that in the months of September through December, which is the next wave that we are going to conduct the survey in, we will be doing field checking of the sample to find out if we indeed are missing out on the outskirts of the villages. So this will be, as we go to every village, we check that village, whether that sample, so there's a kind of a questionnaire that the interviewers have to fill in additionally besides the regular interview to find out the distribution of the sample. We also have aerial pictures of this. So we have already got some idea, but we want more from the field to be sure that we know what is wrong, if anything is wrong at all. So that is a thing that we are going to do. And whatever we find is wrong during the course of September, December, will be acted upon and corrected in the survey of Jan through April 2022. So we will take these 8 months, 4 months to find out where the problem is, if there is any, and 4 months to fix it. So these are the next 2 waves over which we will understand the problem and fix it. Now, I would like to point out one thing, that neither Jean Drees nor anybody else has actually conducted any study of the data to say that there is a problem in it. It is a conjecture that because of the documentation given out by CMI that says this is how we do systematic random sampling. It is a picking up of those couple of lines to say that we do, of course, we do systematic random sampling because we can't do enumeration of the entire village because we get beaten black and blue. So we say that we start from either the east or the north, west or south in that order of preference and go down the main street if there is a main street, if there is a main street. If the organization of households in a village is around a center circle kind of thing, or a central square, say a central market or something, then we of course go around that. So the systematic random sampling is in concentric circles around it. So there could be a main street in a village. If there is, then we begin from the main street and then go in the inner streets. If there is a circle, we begin from the center of the circle and go outside. Now, I take the criticism that this gives a preference to the main street and the center. Okay, so is it the case that we don't reach the outskirts at all? Nobody knows. I think we do reach the outskirts, but I'm not leaving it to that. I think I'll go and check whether I've reached the outskirts adequately or not. Okay. Now, it is not true, as Dr. Mahendra Dev was saying, that this problem is there in cities and villages. It's not a problem in the cities that we survey at all. And that's 2/3 of our sample. So in the cities, we are actually randomly selecting 21 enumeration blocks. So we're not going down the main street of Bombay or Lucknow or wherever to pick households only over there. So there are 21 randomly selected enumeration blocks in which the surveys are being done. So the allegations are conjectures which we are taking seriously. Okay, the allegations are conjectures which we are taking seriously. These are well-meaning people. These are people who I would like that they become serious users of the survey data. And we are interested, the government may or may not be interested, but we are interested in long-term investment into building large, reliable data sets on the Indian households. So that's my response to Mahendra Dev. And Rahman, you made many demands on the databases, what all you would like to see. You'd like to see quantity and value, perhaps, to find out what the total value is, the price and quantity, maybe.
That's our wish list, to understand food systems better.
Right. I will want to understand from you, maybe offline, a little more. You had one slide, you had many things to say. You got just that little 5 minutes to speak. So I would like to understand that a little more in detail, and perhaps find out what is possible to do, because I cannot overload the survey too much. There is a challenge over there, because the objective of the CPHS is not to dive deep into one area. So, for example, the PLFS has an entire survey just on labor markets. And I do labor markets as a small sliver of my larger survey. But I exploit it extremely well. And I have this fast frequency results coming out. We were able to say immediately what is the impact of the pandemic, the lockdown, and so on and so forth. So we are, let me say, different. I have not tried to replicate the PLFS or the NSSO. It would be pointless to do that. I've done things differently. I've got some different definitions. So in that framework, I'd like to understand what is it that you are looking for in more detail, explain to you what my constraints are, and find the best path forward. Okay, so let's work constructively on this.
Yeah, that sounds
what is possible. Okay, that's all that I have to say. Rest assured, there could be possibly some limitations in the sample of the CPHS, but rest assured there is no bias. Any use of bias is misplaced. There's no bias against poor. There's no bias against people of lower caste. There's no bias against anyone. There is no systematic way of saying that we will not sample them and sample this. There is randomness all along in the service selection. It will always happen that we will have some limitations and we'll try and fix them. Thank you so much.
Mahesh, somebody is estimating poverty, ratios from your data. So will that give some idea about the population?
Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's calculate poverty. In fact, Azim Premji University has said that 240 million people have moved into poverty using the same data.
Yeah.
So they had an estimate of how many people are under the poverty line and how many moved in. So people have done it. We haven't done it as yet. Yeah. We will do it for sure. But I think this is doable. This is estimatable. And I don't think you will get numbers which are going to be dramatically different. Yeah. So some people are working on it. I know some people are working using the CPHS data to estimate poverty in the last 4-5 years. So they are actually estimating it from 2014 till now using all the waves of CPHS. Whereas what Azim Premji University people did is only look at the pandemic time. So, and I don't think the people who are working on the poverty that I know, and they've consulted me because they had some difficulty in understanding some indicators, they are finding that the numbers are largely in sync with what the PLFS data could have said. PLFS also captures some consumption data.
Yeah, but PLFS, one short question.
Yeah, I know. So all of these have got limitations. You're taking little patches here and there to draw a larger picture of what's happening.
Yeah, that way CPHS has much more.
It does. It does. So therefore, they're using it now, and they are kind of struggling with getting all the data right, etc. And I hope in the next few weeks they will come out with results, and you'll be able to see them. Yeah. So I'm not getting into the debate and discussion about poverty. My idea is to give out the data and let people use it, solve their problems, give them a platform to discuss this, and so on and so forth. I don't think, Mahendra, you will face a problem if you use this for poverty. Yeah. I'm reasonably sure.
Yeah. But official data, I was co-chairing with Pranab Sen on 2021 consumption data, but I don't know what happened later.
Because that's the problem. That's the problem.
2017-18, they said demonetization, so we should not use. 2021, now COVID, so we should not use. So you can't.
See, Mahendra, that's the problem. They're looking for a normal year.
Yeah, but you may never get.
And you require to know more about the abnormal years.
Yeah.
So what will Soumya and company do if you don't have data for abnormal years?
Yeah.
Nutrition gets hit. Poverty is hit during abnormal years. So the whole idea. And therefore, I say, we are different. We are not replicating what they're doing. We require to have a continuous survey. Quibbling over small things and trying to make it perfect shouldn't make us the enemy of the good. So I think that the problem with the NSSO is they're looking for a normal for national accounts estimations. We require something more real to solve the problems of the country. Sorry, Kaushik, I took too much of your time. Sorry.
Not at all. I loved this. Thank you for coming in. We are beyond time and we try to avoid that as much as we can. But I would love to just quickly turn to Professor Mahendra Dev, Prabhu, Soumya, Andali, Vidya for any last closing remarks you might have. And if none, thank you very much for presenting, for discussing, for the quality of this discussion and engagement. We really love it. I mean, this is why we do this seminar. We want to be able to engage on technical issues about the survey as well as about research with an audience that can appreciate it and also has an interest in what's going on. I really think we were able to do that today. Mahesh, you're raising your finger. Is that a point you want to make?
No, I think Prabhu wanted to say something, I thought.
Yes.
No?
Okay. Prabhu is saying no. Soumya, Andali, Vidya, any last?
No, I think as Mahesh said, we should discuss these things online, things that we have to discuss going further. So we'll set up a call and do that. I think for the seminar, we are good. It was a great engaging conversation.
Great. Professor Mahendra Dev?
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming, for staying later than scheduled. Thanks to the audience for sticking around. We will make sure, authors, that you get a copy of all the questions so that you know who's asked what question, if you'd like to talk with them later. A video of this will always be available on YouTube. And Soumya, you've already sent me your slides, so we'll make sure that that's up on our website as well. Thanks again to all of you for really wonderful research and for a great discussion. We're really eager to talk with you more and see how we can continue to help you in your research.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kaushik.
Thank you.